Our multivariate presentation is on access to basic necessities in Senegal, Africa.
The concept we are measuring is how often the citizens of Senegal are able to meet their basic necessities based on the level of education they have attained, their age, and if they live in an urban area. These variables will later be controlled by the variable type of occupation they have. Setting these barriers of access to basic necessities in third world countries such as Senegal is important because many people around the world are suffering due to these barriers, and it is important that research is done in an attempt to remedy the situation.
The hypothesis is that the higher the level of education attained, the more likely the respondent will be able to meet their basic necessities. This is based off a theory by Magna and Tissé, which explains that illiteracy leads to low personal income since there are less job opportunities for those that have low education levels, which then leads to poverty, which Tissé defines as not having access to water and other basic necessities. Our second hypothesis is that respondents who live in an urban area are more likely to be able to meet their basic necessities. This is based off Kuznets' theory that nations undergoing economic development will go through a period of increasing economic inequality, which would lead to a period of decreasing economic inequality. This transformation from economic inequality to equality is said to be caused by industrialization and urbanization, which leads to the labor force transitioning from lower-paying rural jobs to higher-paying urban jobs. Since Senegal is still a developing country, it can be concluded that it is amidst this transition period where those working in rural environments have lower-paying jobs and those living in urban environments receive higher-paying employment. Our third hypothesis is that younger respondents will be able to meet their basic necessities more often than those who are old and middle-aged. This hypothesis is based off the research by Isabella Abogen, where she discovers that older people have less access to health services and treatment than younger age groups. Being unable to access health services is one of the dependent variables coded in the index, thus being older in age leads to being unable to obtain basic necessities. Our fourth hypothesis states that those working in the service and professional employment sectors would have better access to basic necessities than those in the farming industry. This is based off the research done by A. Kruger, which demonstrates that those working in the farming industry often had limited access to education and lacked the skills to participate in the wider economy, thus having a substantially lower income, which in turn would lead to not being able to afford basic necessities.
Our rationale is that one having a high level of education, living in an urban environment, and being young in age will lead to obtaining employment in the professional or service industry, thus gaining a higher income, which leads to being able to obtain basic necessities. The rationale is based on the hypotheses that were previously outlined. Our index incorporates how often one could obtain food, water, medicine, medical treatment, fuel for cooking, or a cash income. Since each of the alpha deleted item scores are lower than Cronbach's alpha and the standardized alpha, we decided to not eliminate any of these variables because the Cronbach's alpha would actually go down if we did. Having an alpha score of 0.8227 means that all of these dependent variables are asking similar questions and are related in nature.
When analyzing this regression, the b-value for level of education is 0.59, meaning that respondents with a higher education level are 0.59 times more likely to be able to obtain basic necessities. The b-value for living in an urban environment is 3.13, meaning that those living in an urban environment are 3 times more likely to be able to gain basic necessities, whereas respondents who were middle-aged had a b-value of negative 0.74, meaning that middle-aged respondents were 7.4 times less likely to be able to obtain basic necessities than younger respondents. Level of education, living in an urban environment, and being middle-aged were all statistically significant since they were above the 0.05 threshold. Old age was considered not statistically significant, which means that older respondents were not statistically significantly different from younger respondents. Thus, compared to middle-aged respondents, they do not have difficulty in obtaining basic necessities. The beta value for living in an urban environment is the highest at 0.27, meaning that living in an urban environment is the best predictor for obtaining basic necessities, while middle-aged has the lowest beta score at negative 0.06, meaning that being middle-aged has the least influence on being able to obtain basic necessities. The R-square and adjust R-square are around 19%, meaning that 19% of the variation in access to basic necessities can be explained by the independent variables. There is no issues of multicollinearity since the tolerance levels varied from 0.79 to 0.89, which are all well above the 0.2 threshold where multicollinearity is a concern.
We decided to use the control variable of type of occupation one has. We recoded Q95 as a dummy variable into 6 categories, which are manual labor, service industry, professional employment, other, no employment, and farmer. Farmer is the reference category because it has the highest number of respondents.
When looking at the regression with the control variable added, we can see that the B values of level of education and living in an urban environment have dropped slightly but still remain positive predictors of obtaining basic necessities. Looking at the control variable, we can see that the B values of all types of employment are positive, meaning that all types of employment will lead to being able to obtain necessities compared to working in the farming industry. Service industry has the highest B value among type of employment at 2.03, meaning that those working in the service industry are 2 times more likely to obtain basic necessities than those working in the farming industry. The highest beta value is still living in an urban environment at 0.24, meaning that living in an urban environment best predicts being able to obtain basic necessities, while the lowest is once again middle-aged respondents at negative 0.07, meaning that being middle-aged has the least influence on obtaining basic necessities. Other employment, no employment, and old age were all statistically insignificant, meaning that they were not statistically significantly different from their dummy category. Thus, older respondents were no significantly different from young respondents, and other employment and no employment were no significantly different from farm employment when it came to being able to obtain basic necessities. The R-square and adjusted R-square are around 19%, meaning that 19% of the variation in access to basic necessities can be explained by the independent variables. There is no issue of multicollinearity since the tolerance levels varied from 0.6 to 0.86, which are well below the 0.2 threshold where multicollinearity is a concern.
When adding the control variable, we can see that there is a spurious relationship. This is because most of the original B values of the independent variables went down when the control variable type of education was added. This means that one's type of employment is a stronger predictor of obtaining basic necessities than living in an urban area or level of education obtained. When there is a spurious relationship, there are 2 ways it can be conceptualized: explanation or interpretation.
When looking at the conceptual models, interpretation makes the most sense for the spurious relationship. This is because your level of education and living in an urban area would affect the type of employment that you would receive, which would then lead to being able to gain basic necessities.
Since the B values of the independent variables do not decrease by twice the amount of the standard deviation, the elaboration is replication, meaning that there was no significant change with the addition of the control variable.
In conclusion, the regression analyses have found that living in an urban environment, attaining a high level of education, being younger in age, and being employed in the professional, service, or manual sector all lead to being able to obtain basic necessities.